Hello, my friends. This is Lynda Lippin, and welcome to the Pilates Goddess podcast. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back yet again to the Pilates Goddess podcast. This is your host, Lynda Lippin, and today we are discussing the roll up. In this series that I'm doing on the Pilates exercises and kind of giving you a deep dive into each exercise that I hope will be useful for both Pilates teachers and for people who practice Pilates either on their own, in class, with a different teacher. We will talk about each exercise, break it down into component parts, talk about how to modify it, how to vary it, how to do it on different pieces of equipment in the studio, and talk about other exercises that it may relate to. So each exercise is really going to get a nice deep dive for you so that you can really think about things and understand what it is you're doing with each exercise in the system of Pilates. And yes, I am reminding you one more time that Pilates is a system of exercises and not just some particular exercises done in some random way or some random order. So the second exercise in the mat is something called the roll up. And the roll up is pretty much what it sounds like. You start lying down with your legs straight, and then you roll up to sitting, stretching forward, and then you roll right back down. So if you remember when we took a look at the 100 on Tuesday, and if you haven't listened to it, I recommend going back and listening to that episode. But when you look at the 100, you're looking at an exercise that starts to warm up the spine and the torso and the abdominal muscles and the joints a little bit, right? You're in a little bit of upper back flexion. The rest of the spine is pretty much steady and stable. You're working on abdominal endurance and the ability to breathe in that position. Once you've gotten through that, the next two exercises in the mat deal with mobilizing your spine in the sagittal plane, okay? So we look at mobilizing first from the top, fixing the bottom of the body and allowing the spine to move from the head to the lower back and the tail. And then when we look at rollover next week, we'll then be looking at an exercise that mobilizes the spine from the bottom to the top in the same thing, in flexion, in sagittal plane. Now, I have to tell you that spine mobility is an important thing. And it's especially an important thing for folks with healthy spines, or even folks who might have some arthritis or, some other issues, but have good bone density, maybe are just a little bit tight or a little bit weak, and need to work on that kind of length and space and strength in that roll up. I also want you to realize that even though it is true that people spend a lot of time in forward flexion, that we sit a lot, that you see people and kids and everybody rounded over their phones, rounded over their stuff, that mobilization of the spine with length, with control, and with breath is very, very different than just slumping down in your chair to do something. The roll up done properly teaches you and teaches your clients how to really stabilize through the legs and through the back of the body, okay? And how to move, and teaches you how to move your spine without necessarily shoving your spine into the mat or tucking your pelvis or doing anything like that. In fact, for the rolling up, for the majority of the time, your pelvis is in neutral, okay? Does move into a posterior tilt as you come up for the roll up. And the same thing on the way back, you're in a posterior tilt to get back. But once your lowest ribs come down, your pelvis resolves to neutral, which simply means heavy in the sacrum without your lower back shoving down into the mat. You're going to notice in these podcast episodes on the exercises that I do not discuss neutral spine. If you have a question about why, go back to my early episode on the myth of neutral spine. And that will tell you everything you need to know from me on that topic. So let's first just talk about what we're working in the roll up, what's happening in the roll up, okay? The roll up at its best is decompressing the spine, and it's literally using gravity, breath, and your muscles to help decompress and lengthen the spine. Helps lengthening it from the front and from the back, and making a little space between the vertebrae. Done poorly, the roll up can, in fact, cause lower back compression, can cause lower rib compression, and can really screw up your back. Just letting you know. Especially if you're doing it daily or, several times a week without great mechanics. The roll up is not an exercise to throw yourself through. It's not an exercise to use momentum to get through. It is literally an exercise where you need to use all the control that you can. And we'll talk in a second about ways to find that work and find that control, even if you're just working on the mat and not on any of the apparatus. Because it's essentially a full sit-up, okay, this exercise works all of the abdominal muscles. It literally works all 4 layers of the abdominals. You're not using the obliques so much here for rotation, but the obliques do also work to assist that flexion of the rib cage. Okay, so you're really looking at the whole complex of the abdominals working in length. You are also doing a lot of work in this exercise to stabilize your lower body. Okay, so your hamstrings are working. The low glutes are working a little bit to keep the bottom of your pelvis kind of down and connected to your legs. Your hip flexors are working because when you roll up, you're coming into hip flexion. So it's a dance between your hip flexors, your abdominal muscles, and your stabilizing muscles to all work together in good timing and good sequencing to get the movement happening. In its full form, you start the roll up on your back. Say you've come out of your 100. Your heels are still together. Your legs are on the mat now. Your torso's on the mat. You reach your arms up to the ceiling and back overhead. You take a deep breath. You lift up your arms. And then you literally roll up your spine to sitting, reaching your hands forward past your feet, flexing your feet if you can to just get a really strong stretch through the calves and the hamstrings, and then rolling back down with the same amount of control. The biggest issue that I find people have with the roll up is that people tuck their pelvises backwards in a posterior tilt, i.e., they tuck their pelvis under, pre-tuck, flatten out their lower backs. And then what happens as you go to roll up is you're just compressing basically all of your body weight into your lumbar spine. Your tailbone at that point may even be up off the mat a little bit. So it makes it almost impossible to roll up past that lower back and move forward without a whole lot of compression and inappropriate loading into the discs of your lumbar spine. So if this is something you experience, you're rolling up, you're doing that tuck, your legs are flying up in the air with you, and you're finding it hard to get that separation and hard to get any depth or length in your spine coming up. A little aside here, sometimes I'll tell my clients, you want to feel like a fruit roll up or like dough, that you're just laying yourself down on the mat and then you're rolling yourself and peeling yourself back up. But if you find that, your hip flexors are tight, things aren't maybe as strong as they could be and coordinated, it's not always an issue of strength and flexibility. Sometimes it's also just timing and coordination of all the muscles trying to do their little part to help the whole movement, right? Then the best thing you can do is, if you're in a studio, you can take a couple of those black sticky mats, that we might use under somebody for stomach massage or things like that. And you're going to take those two sticky mats horizontally under your lower back, literally under the lower back curve, so that you can still get your sacrum, the wide bone at the bottom of your pelvis, of your spine. You can still get your sacrum down on the mat. And this way, as you go to roll up, you're going to keep the sacrum heavy, deep in the abdominals, try to get the length. But if you go to shove your lower back down, your butt's going to come all the way up off the ground and you won't be able to do the exercises. So it's basically those pads or a folded up hand towel or something under your back that's maybe, between like maybe half and an inch high. That is going to help you find that positioning of keeping the bottom of your spine down and heavy, keeping your pelvis in one position, and getting the deep abdominal work and the stabilization work to roll up your spine. Within the Pilates studio, of course, if you're on a studio mat, you've got a strap at the end of the mat. That will help. Fixing the feet will help by giving them something to pull against instead of just lifting up. Okay, and you can combine them. You can use the foot strap and use the pad under the lower back. You can also put a little more weight in the upper body. And the reason why I say that is that when you do the roll up, your arms start back overhead, but then your arms actually lead the movement by lifting up to the ceiling as your head and upper body curl up. So if you have in a Pilates studio, we have a lot of light weighted bars that are like 2 or 3 pounds total, or light hand weights. Bringing those in front of your body as you're rolling up will give you a little extra oomph, a little extra push moving forward without you having to take that into your spine, okay, and compress your spine. This is especially important for folks who have existing lower back issues, disc injuries, and whatever else, arthritis. You want to be able to pull the abdominals in and not just shove and compress that back down. Now, there are a few folks for whom spine mobility in this plane, in flexion, in sagittal plane, is not going to be great. That's going to be your folks who have disc issues and injuries, or spine and vertebrae issues and injuries. These are going to be your people with osteoporosis or lower bone density, where you want to avoid a lot of forward thoracic flexion and rolling through the spine, because that can cause crush fractures in the front of the vertebrae that can leave a person with basically a humpback kind of hunched over forever. Indeed. So be mindful that, if somebody comes into you and they've got a lot of disc injury, or they're very hypermobile and not very strong, or they have low bone density or osteoporosis, these are not folks you're going to even think about doing the roll up with. Okay, there's other modifications and variations you can do with them. I talk a lot about those in other episodes of this podcast, right? We're now at like 100 episodes. Okay, so there's a lot of previous material. If you're new, I recommend going back and listening to all of the episodes starting from the beginning. There's some great interviews and there's some great discussion about how to modify things for various clients with various issues and injuries. If you're in a full Pilates studio, there are tons of places to do the roll up. Tons. So you can do the roll up on the mat. And you can do the roll up on the mat using the strap. You can use pads. You can put the weighted bar or weights in the hands. Roll up there. If you are getting more advanced and you want to challenge yourself with the roll up, keep your arms next to your head as you're rolling up so that the arms don't lead going forward. You can also play with speed. You can play with tempo. You can play with time under tension. You can stop the roll up at different sections of the roll up and make people or yourself hold it, get a little deeper, roll up a little more. So there are definitely ways to progress that just on the mat. Okay. Another obvious place to do the roll up is the Cadillac, where we call it the roll back because we start sitting up holding the rollback bar, right, with our feet against the poles. What does that do? It offers assistance as well as resistance. So then, because you're in a closed kinetic chain environment with the feet on the fixed poles, the hands on the bar, then you can really focus on where your back is and where your spine is, using that spring assistance to come up, feeling how the abdominals work, and then seeing if you can recreate that without the bar and the springs. And there are, modifications and variations on that on the Cadillac as well. You can come all the way down into the roll down. And when you're down on the mat holding the bar, you can bend your elbows, pull the bar to your chest. You can do a version of chest expansion here, pressing the bar straight down to your thighs. You can, there's versions of the rollback where you roll down, lift up your chest into hyperextension, do shoulder pulls there and come up, and then vice versa. Coming back in a back bend, dropping back, doing the arm pulls, flattening the back and rolling up. You can also add a side stretch to that. When you're on the Cadillac, you can do it with one arm. So many options here. There's also a version of the roll up using the push through bar, which is essentially the beginning of teaser with the push through bar, except that you keep the legs down and just roll up the upper back and come back down. And if you or your client is really strong, you can actually do the roll up with the tower with a bottom spring. Never do this with anybody with low bone density or with known disc issues. You can press the bar up with your hands and then roll up your spine, again, keeping the legs down. You can also do teaser in that place. All right. Now, the roll up from the mat also shows up standing, right? We have standing versions of that exercise on the Wunda chair, standing versions of that exercise on the high barrel, where you're standing with your back toward the hump of the barrel. The ladder is away from you by the wall. And you roll down your spine. Then you roll back up and take a back bend over the barrel, come out of that and roll forward again. You can also do the same exercise standing against a wall, okay, or just standing on the floor. So there are many places where we are fixing that lower body and rolling up that upper body. And that is essentially what the roll up is. Again, for just the plain roll up, the biggest favor you can do to anybody who is either having a hard time in lifting up their legs or who is managing to keep their legs down, but you can see that they're just compressing everything into their lower back as they come up, is again putting some towel or pads under their lumbar spine. This may be you, under your lumbar spine, so that you can keep the bottom of your pelvis down on the ground, deep in the belly, and work on the spine articulation. Once again, if spine articulation is something you should be working on. I know we talk a lot in Pilates about spine articulation as if it was like the greatest thing, and it is the greatest thing for healthy spines. And teaching proper biomechanics of spine articulation and sagittal plane is really helpful for clients. And let's face it, we want to teach clients times when they want to articulate their spine and times when they don't, right? There's times when we want that spine to not move. There's times when we want that spine to move. And here in just the first two exercises, we get that, okay? We get the 100 where whether you're keeping your head down or curling your head up, you are holding your spine in position for that entire exercise. Once you're in it, the torso is not moving other than you're breathing, okay? And then you follow that with suddenly an exercise in mobility from the top of the spine. So I'm really interested in hearing your guys' experience teaching the roll up and doing the roll up and maybe trying variations on the roll up. You can leave your comments in multiple places. You can certainly leave a comment on my post for this episode at pilatesgoddess.com. You can send me an email to Lynda@lindalippin.com. You can actually leave me a voicemail if you wish at pilatesgoddess.com. And you can also feel free to comment on any of my posts in one of my groups, DM me on any social media. You will find me, Lynda Lippin or Lynda Lippin Pilates, and let me know what your experience of doing or teaching the roll up was like, and if it's any better with a new understanding or a new depth that you might have as a result of listening to this episode and trying some of the modifications and variations. I would love to hear from you about this, and I will see you soon for the rollover. Have a great rest of your day, a great rest of your week. As always, thank you so much for listening to the podcast, for sharing the podcast, for your comments, for your questions. And if you love it, Please go to Spotify to leave a rating. Go to Apple Podcasts where you can leave a rating and a written review, or to Podchaser where you can also leave a rating and a written review. All of those links are in the show notes. Thanks again, and I will talk to you soon. Bye. Thank you so much for listening to the Pilates Goddess podcast. Music brought to you by Nerd Salad. Please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, especially if you liked it. And please like, share, and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks.